Today let's talk about tune-ups on P80 cars. P80 chassis just simply refers to 850s, S70s, V70s, C70s. There's a few things that you need to know when you're tuning up one of these cars, but sometimes it gets a little confusing if you're not sure where to start. Maybe you just bought the car, maybe you know it's just not doing what it should be doing and you don't know where to go. First step is always going to be buy yourself a service manual. Also refer to your owner's manual. It's going to have a full service schedule in there, and it's an excellent place to start to create your guide for service work. So now that we have that and you have your basic tools, what do? Let's talk about it. So where are these pieces on the engine, and what are the things to look for when you're doing a tune-up? Now most people know that a basic tune-up is an ignition tune-up, and that usually consists of spark plugs and a few other things. In the case of these cars up through 1998, that means also, just like the early cars, spark plug wires, distributor cap, ignition rotor, all those things. And if you look down here, you'll find that on this car, it's right here, right next to the back side of the motor, next to the airbox. You'll have the leads coming from the distributor cap there, rotor there, spark plugs. Check your service manual for how to do that exact job. Now what's beyond that? Probably you've heard people say they check the fluids, they check the filters, they do all that stuff. What does that mean? In this car, you've got an air filter. Most people know about that, and that's right over here in the big airbox next to the battery. You've also got a fuel filter on these cars, and that's going to be under the car. It doesn't have to be done as often as some of the other things, but still needs to be done. They've also got, in some of these cars, they're equipped with what's called a pollen filter or a cabin air filter, and that's part of a tune-up as well. On these cars, it's underneath the cowl here. And check your service manual for where it is on your exact year and model. Now, what fluids do you need to check? We all know you need to check your oil. It's a good thing to do that, every week or so, depending on the car. It's also a good thing to check to make sure your power steering fluid is at the appropriate level every once in a while. Make sure your coolant is not only at the right level, but it looks right. It's the right color. It doesn't look like it's getting all cruddy or weird or anything, or starting to get discolored. If it is, then it's time to change it. Beyond that, you've also got things to look for that are kind of key indicators of other symptoms. You'll hear a lot about PCV systems or flame trap systems on these cars. A good indicator of that failing is going to be oil seeping out, and you'll notice that especially around the oil cap. If you start seeing a little bit of oil pushing out here, or notice some drips around the front of the engine on the bottom indicating it might be dripping out of one of the front oil seals, that's a good indicator that it's time to address that PCV system. It's a little more in-depth repair, but there's lots of good documentation out there, both in service manuals and on places like YouTube and the forums and places like that. If you find that you need to do that, it's pretty important to take care of it as a course of maintenance. It's going to do wonders for the tune-up of your car later, and the runnability of it, and the longevity of it, and the cleanliness of your engine bay too. Another piece of maintenance that's a good thing to check while you're in here looking at everything that's not really part of a tune-up per se, but it's very, very important, is the belt drive system. These, instead of having separate V-belts for alternator, AC, etc., it has one belt called a serpentine belt. It's pretty easy to see here. Right next to your power steering fluid pump, you've got the access to see the basics of the belt here, and it's just like any other rubber belt. Look for signs of cracking, of dry rotting, those types of things. If that belt breaks, you're going to be stranded. Nothing's going to work. Charging system's down, no power steering, all that stuff. So check that. Beyond that you can't quite see, but it's important to take the time to look at every once in a while, is the timing belt. The timing belt drives everything. The camshafts, it drives off the crank, it drives the water pump even on these models. If that thing breaks, or if the tensioner fails or anything like that, it can be catastrophic. Valves are going to come in contact with pistons. It's no good. Basically ends up meaning you need a new head on the car if that thing breaks. So stick to the service schedule on that. It's going to be about every 70,000 miles on these cars. Or if you don't know when it was done last, pop the timing cover off and take a look at it. Same thing, it's a rubber belt that's reinforced. Look for dry rotting, look for cracks in the edge and stuff. If you don't know when it was done last and it looks a little marginal, just do it. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot else to talk about for basic tune-up stuff on these models. To be aware though, 1999 and later models switched to a distributorless system. Instead of having a separate ignition coil with a cap, rotor, plugs, wires, all that stuff as separate pieces, it's got individual ignition coils on top of each spark plug. Now on the upside, that means that when you do an ignition tune-up, you're really only changing spark plugs. You don't have to bother with the rest of the stuff. So in that regard, it's a lot simpler. Now the other side of that is that every once in a while you might get a failure in those ignition coils that can rear its ugly head with misfire codes, weird stumbles, things like that. So while it means that it's not as much of a wear item like a cap and rotor would be, it's still something that needs to be inspected and checked and looked at and replaced at some point when it does fail. So of note, not totally important, but good to look at, good to be aware of. That's the gist of it for these cars. Nothing super complicated, but sometimes helps to have a little bit of guidance. If you have questions on which pieces are right for your car, what kits we have available, etc., check our website at ipdusa.com.